Long before Wallis Simpson changed the course of the British monarchy, there was another woman. She was beautiful, admired, and spoken of in whispers through the gilded ballrooms of Edwardian England. Her name was Lady Rosemary Leveson-Gower, the woman many believed might one day wear a crown. But history had other plans. Her life began in privilege, wrapped in the grandeur of castles and wealth. Yet it ended in sorrow, cut short by tragedy, and her name nearly erased from memory. Before we begin this forgotten story, if you love uncovering the untold lives of women who shaped history, make sure to subscribe. Each week, we bring back voices that time tried to silence. Now let's just step into the world of Lady Rosemary Leveson-Gower. Rosemary was born on August 8, 1893, inside the towering walls of Dunrobin Castle in Scotland. This was no ordinary home. Dunrobin was one of the grandest strongholds in Britain, seat of the Dukes of Sutherland, her family's title. The Sutherlands were not just aristocrats, they were landowners on a scale that seemed unreal. Her grandfather commanded more acres than any other man in Europe. Their estates stretched to the horizon. Hills, valleys, forests, rivers, a kingdom in all but name. It was said that when the Shah of Persia once saw the family's Trentham estate, he remarked that the grandeur was so immense, the Duke should be executed for living like a rival king. Even Queen Victoria herself, on visiting Stafford House, had greeted Rosemary Sip's grandmother with the words, "I come from my house to your palace." From the start, Rosemary's life was steeped in royalty's shadow. Her grandmother had served as Queen Victoria's mistress of the robes. Her mother, Millicent Sutherland, would later carry Queen Mary's canopy at her coronation. Everything about Rosemary's birth spoke of destiny. She belonged to a family at the heart of Britain's power. Yet for all the pomp, Rosemary's early life was not cold or distant. Her father, Cromarty Sutherland, was quiet, gentle, and happiest outdoors. He often took his daughter sailing along the Scottish coast, teaching her to fish and filling her childhood with calm joy. Her mother, Millicent, was very different, bold, outspoken, and brilliant. Known as the democratic Duchess, she was more than just a society hostess. She was an activist, campaigning for workers' rights, exposing the dangers of lead poisoning in factories, and building hospitals for the poor. Millicent was also a writer and a reformer. She taught Rosemary that privilege was not just for enjoyment, but also for service. From an early age, Rosemary learned compassion, standing by her mother as she visited charities, spoke for social causes, and built institutions to protect children and the disabled. This was the legacy that would shape Rosemary's heart, the mix of privilege and responsibility, of diamonds and duty. Even as a child, Rosemary moved in rare circles. At just 11 years old, she was one of the few girls invited to play alongside the young Prince of Wales, Edward, the boy who would one day cause the abdication crisis. At Queen Alexandra's birthday party for the prince in 1904, Rosemary appeared in a simple white dress with a pink bow. The children laughed and clapped as circus acts entertained them. Few could guess that one of those laughing children would later capture the prince's heart. By her teenage years, Rosemary was already noted for her beauty, charm, and striking personality. She loved riding horses, not the expected side saddle, but boldly astride, the wind rushing through her hair. She laughed easily, often too loudly for Edwardian decorum, and her radiant personality made her magnetic in every gathering. Family friends remembered her mischievous spirit. The playwright J.M. Barrie, author of Peter Pan, adored her and even modeled one of his characters, Mary Rose, after her. Rosemary was no ordinary debutante. She was bright, daring, and unforgettable. In 1909, Rosemary was sent abroad for finishing school in Germany and then Paris. She studied music, languages, and manners, but her free spirit was not easily restrained. One frustrated piano teacher, after a poor performance, threw her sheet music to the floor and declared she was hopeless. If Rosemary was not a scholar, she was instead a star of society. In 1911, she made her social debut in London. The newspapers called her the girl of the season. The Tatler praised her daring and distinctive personality. Ballrooms filled with music and chandeliers became her stage. Suitors surrounded her, from dukes' sons to decorated officers. Yet Rosemary was no easy conquest. She was playful, elusive, and kept her admirers at a distance. Still, one man came close, John Manners, son of the Duke of Rutland. Their families had known each other for years, and whispers of an engagement began to swirl in 1913. Jewels were even purchased, and society awaited the announcement. But fate intervened. Rosemary fell ill with appendicitis and required surgery. During her recovery, doubts about the marriage grew. Eventually, she broke off the engagement, leaving John heartbroken. It would not be the last time Rosemary's life seemed poised for greatness, only to slip away. Soon after, in 1913, her beloved father died suddenly of a heart attack. The quiet man who had been her anchor was gone, leaving Rosemary devastated. But even as she grieved, the world around her was changing. Storm clouds were gathering across Europe. The carefree days of glittering dances and endless summers were ending. The Great War was about to begin. And with it, Rosemary's destiny would shift from the sparkling ballrooms of London to the blood-stained hospitals of France. The summer of 1914 shattered the illusion of endless dances and golden youth. The guns of Europe roared, and the world Rosemary knew collapsed overnight. The glittering circles of London high society scattered as young men traded tuxedos for khaki uniforms, marching into the storm of war. Rosemary, only 21, stepped into a role few could have imagined for a duke's daughter. She and her mother established a hospital in France, determined not to watch idly from the safety of their castles, but to stand where the suffering was greatest. Their hospital at Dunkirk became a refuge for broken bodies and wounded spirits, and soon Rosemary's hands were no longer adorned only with jewels, but with the scars of service. Day after day she washed floors, rolled bandages, cleaned wounds, and sat beside men who trembled from shell shock. Yet what set her apart was not only her labor, but the warmth she carried into the bleak wards. She picked wild poppies from the fields and placed them in vases by the beds of injured soldiers, small bursts of color amid the grey misery of war. Soldiers adored her for her kindness, for the cheer she brought, for the laughter that still echoed even in the darkest corners. The girl who had once stolen sips of champagne at society weddings now offered tea to men who had lost arms and legs, smiling as though her joy alone could hold them together. Her devotion did not go unnoticed. Rosemary became skilled as a surgical nurse, praised for her calm under pressure. She never recoiled at the sight of mangled faces or shattered limbs. Instead, she leaned closer, her steady voice reminding the wounded they were not forgotten. To many soldiers, she was not just a nurse, but a symbol of life, proof that beauty and compassion could still exist amid the slaughter. For this, she was officially mentioned in dispatches, an honor reserved for those who displayed exceptional service at the front. But war spares no one. Her closest friend, Monica Grenfell, lost a brother in battle, and Rosemary rushed to her side. Together they drove through the countryside, seeking brief moments of normalcy, only to be nearly caught in a bombing raid. They laughed nervously afterward, two young women in the shadow of death, clinging to whatever fragments of joy they could find. A few weeks later, Monica's other brother was killed. It was grief upon grief, and Rosemary stood by her friend like a sister, both of them bound by losses that defined their generation. It was during these years that Rosemary's path crossed more closely with the Prince of Wales, Edward. The prince often visited hospitals, his presence lifting soldiers' spirits. At Rosemary's family hospital, he witnessed her gentleness firsthand. On one visit, he watched as she sat with a soldier whose mind had been shattered by shell shock. Patiently, Rosemary coaxed him with stories, pausing to let him fill in missing words, until the man at last whispered a single word, "Darling." Edward saw the quiet miracle she had worked, and it left an impression he never forgot. Soon after, Edward joined Rosemary and her circle of friends on walks along the shore, dinners in quiet rooms, even an occasional cinema outing. For a young prince drowning in duty and expectation, Rosemary was refreshingly genuine. She treated him not as a figure of authority, but as a man, someone who needed kindness more than deference. Their bond grew in the stillness between the chaos, a connection built not on titles but on shared resilience. Yet in the royal palaces, whispers of this companionship stirred unease. Queen Mary was coldly reserved, and when Edward admitted he found Rosemary striking, his mother dismissed it. She envisioned her son marrying a European princess, not the daughter of an aristocrat with complicated family ties. Rosemary's mother, though admired, carried a history the Queen considered too scandalous, and the Leveson-Gower line bore eccentricities that did not fit the monarchy's rigid expectations. Behind palace walls, quiet decisions were already shaping Rosemary's fate. Still, Edward's affection deepened. He sought her out at society balls, danced with her longer than any other woman, and invited her on drives through the countryside. Rosemary, unlike so many others, did not fawn over him. She once advised a cousin on how to handle the prince: curtsy low, call him sir, and treat him like dirt. This mixture of respect and indifference fascinated Edward. He was drawn to women who resisted, who carried a quiet strength, and Rosemary embodied this perfectly. Eventually, his feelings became undeniable. In private moments he proposed to her, a prince offering a crown. At first Rosemary hesitated. She did not crave titles or palaces. She wrote to a friend, describing Edward as irresponsible and childish, yet she believed she could help shape him into something greater. Slowly she accepted, imagining herself not only as his wife, but as his guiding influence, perhaps even as the queen who could steady a restless heir. But their secret hope was crushed before it could bloom. King George and Queen Mary opposed the union. They would not allow their son to marry her. To them, Rosemary's family scandals, her mother's controversies, and the shadow of divorce in her lineage were unacceptable. They envisioned a dynastic marriage, not a love match. And so the decision was made, quietly, firmly, irrevocably. Edward was devastated. In letters to his confidant Freda Dudley Ward, he admitted that Rosemary was the only girl he could ever truly marry, but his parents forbade it. Rosemary herself withdrew with dignity, her acceptance never rooted in ambition, but in a belief she could help him. She stepped back into silence, carrying the weight of what might have been. Historians later argued that this rejection planted the seeds of Edward's rebellion. Denied the woman he admired and respected, he turned instead to mistresses, to married women who offered him escape from authority. The monarchy had dismissed a potential queen of strength and compassion, and in doing so, they set Edward on the path that would one day lead to Wallis Simpson and abdication. For Rosemary, the broken engagement was not the end of her story, but the beginning of a new chapter filled with more love, more sorrow, and deeper tragedy. Within a year, she would marry William Ward, Viscount Ednam, a decorated war hero who adored her. Their wedding drew royals and aristocrats alike, even the prince, whose smile was muted as he watched the woman he had once hoped to call his own. The marriage seemed promising. Rosemary and William settled into life together, and soon their first child was born, with the Prince of Wales himself as godfather. For a moment, happiness returned. She decorated their London home with art and elegance, transforming it into a haven of beauty. But as often in Rosemary's life, shadows lurked behind the sunshine. Tragedy was never far away. A daughter was lost late in pregnancy. Her husband's attention wandered, entangling him in affairs with society women. The glamorous world she inhabited was a world of shifting loyalties, whispered scandals, and quiet betrayals. Rosemary endured it with dignity, but her heart carried scars that no jewels could hide. And then, the deepest wound of all. In 1929, her beloved son John Jeremy was killed in a sudden accident at the age of 7. The little boy who had filled her world with laughter was gone in an instant, struck down as he rode his bicycle across a London bridge. Rosemary collapsed into grief, unable to bear the silence of the home that had once echoed with his voice. She built a garden in his memory, planting flowers where his laughter once bloomed. But fate was not finished with her. Less than a year later, in 1930, Rosemary herself would die in a plane crash, only 36 years old. Edward, now Prince of Wales, mourned deeply, writing that it was one of the greatest tragedies he had ever known. Her story ended not with a crown, but with sorrow, her legacy remembered as the queen who never was. Yet in those years between the ballrooms and the battlefields, between privilege and pain, she lived a life of compassion, strength, and grace. She nursed the wounded, inspired the forgotten, and even captured the heart of a future king. Hers was a life brief but brilliant, and though nearly forgotten, it remains a testament to the power of resilience and love in the face of fate. The wedding bells rang on a crisp January morning in 1919. Westminster's ancient stones echoed with whispers as aristocrats, royals, and courtiers filled the pews. At the center stood Lady Rosemary Leveson-Gower, radiant and composed, walking down the aisle of St. Margaret's, Westminster, to marry William Ward, Viscount Ednam. He was a war hero, decorated for his service in Italy, handsome and admired. To many it seemed a match blessed by fate, the perfect union of nobility, love, and resilience after the chaos of war. But behind the smiles, one figure sat quietly, his expression muted. The Prince of Wales, Edward, had come to witness the woman he had once hoped to make his queen marry another man. His smile was faint, his heart heavy. In letters to his confidant Fred Dudley Ward, he later admitted the engagement had caught him by surprise, and though he wished her happiness, he could not help but feel sorrow. The marriage marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a chapter that would bring Rosemary joy, but also heartbreak deeper than she had ever known. The early years of her marriage glowed with promise. Rosemary and William welcomed their first son, named William but fondly called Billy, in 1920. The Prince of Wales agreed to be the child's godfather, a symbolic thread connecting the past affection and the present bond. Rosemary settled into her new home in London, a stately Queen Anne townhouse once belonging to the artist James McNeill Whistler. With an artist's eye, she transformed it into a masterpiece, filling rooms with light, color, and warmth. A dining room mural depicted the Chelsea Bridge and the River Thames, a tribute to beauty and heritage. For a time, life seemed generous. Yet shadows soon intruded. Rosemary's next pregnancy ended in heartbreak. She carried a daughter late into term, naming her Mary Rose, only to lose the child before she could take her first breath. The loss shattered her. Her husband, away on military duties in Italy, wrote anguished letters filled with guilt and grief. "My life away from you is impossible and worse than death," he confessed. "I cannot concentrate on anything else." But words could not mend the absence, the empty cradle, the silent nursery. Rosemary carried the pain with quiet dignity, masking her sorrow behind grace. Two more sons followed. John Jeremy, born in 1922, and Peter, born in 1924. They filled Rosemary's days with laughter, their small footsteps chasing through the grand halls of their home. She became a devoted mother, pouring all her affection into them, shielding them with the warmth that had defined her own childhood. To friends she was radiant, her face lighting up at the mention of her children, her voice softening when she spoke of them. But motherhood, as fulfilling as it was, could not shield her from the cracks spreading in her marriage. William, admired and dashing, was restless. The post-war world had loosened morals in high society, and affairs and flirtations were common currency among the aristocracy. Soon whispers spread of his entanglement with Venetia Montague, a woman whose own relationships were storied and tangled. Their rumored affair produced a daughter, Judith, in 1923. Though Venetia's husband tolerated the secret, the knowledge weighed on Rosemary. Her marriage, once glowing, grew strained. She endured with dignity, rarely giving voice to her pain. When society tongues wagged, she smiled and remained composed. To those close to her, however, the strain was visible. Friends recalled tense silences between Rosemary and William, arguments muffled behind closed doors, and the weary sadness in her eyes. Yet Rosemary did not retreat into bitterness. Instead, she sought solace in her friendships, her philanthropy, and the resilience that had carried her through war. One of her closest companions remained Duff Cooper, witty and charming, who had long admired her. They played tennis, attended gatherings, and shared confidences. Their friendship sparked jealousy in others, but Rosemary held firm. She was not careless, nor was she reckless. Her heart remained bound to her children, her strength anchored in their laughter. She bore her husband's betrayals with silent endurance, turning her energy instead to the causes she cherished. Rosemary was not a woman content to be idle. She followed her mother's path, stepping into public life with conviction. She became president of the North Staffordshire Cripple Society, campaigning tirelessly for the rights and dignity of disabled people. She raised funds, spoke passionately at events, and worked alongside volunteers, ensuring the society was not a hollow institution, but a living force of compassion. She also championed maternal and infant welfare, laying the foundation stone for a maternity hospital that would later bear her name, the Rosemary Ednam House. Wherever she went, her warmth broke barriers. To the working classes, she was not a distant aristocrat, but a woman who cared, who listened, who acted. At the same time, she became her husband's greatest political asset. When William entered Parliament as a Conservative, Rosemary stood beside him, her speeches captivating audiences with wit and grace. Women had only recently gained the right to vote, and Rosemary seized the moment, urging them to use their newfound power wisely. "On us women lies a grave and great responsibility," she declared, her voice steady. "In our hands rests the future of this small but historic island." Her words stirred, her presence inspired. In an age when women were still finding their voice in public life, Rosemary spoke with clarity and passion. Yet even as she campaigned, even as she championed causes and raised her children, fate stalked her. In 1929, tragedy struck with a force that shattered her heart. Her 7-year-old son, John Jeremy, full of life and laughter, was killed in a sudden accident. He had been riding his bicycle across the Albert Suspension Bridge in London when he collided with a lorry. In an instant, the boy who had filled her world with joy was gone. Rosemary rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. He had slipped away before she could hold him one last time. The grief was unbearable. Friends described her as hollow, her laughter silenced, her eyes dulled. She could not bear to remain in the house that had once echoed with Jeremy's footsteps. Together with William, she left it behind, seeking refuge in the quiet of Himley Hall. There, in her mourning, she created a garden in her son's memory, planting flowers and laying stones, crafting a sanctuary where his spirit could linger. It was her solace, her way of turning unbearable pain into something she could touch, nurture, and hold. But sorrow rarely comes alone. In the years that followed, loss continued to stalk her family. A brother died of malaria in Rhodesia. A cousin dear to her took his own life. Friends fell to tragedy, and whispers of a curse seemed to follow the Sutherlands. Rosemary endured, but each loss carved deeper into her heart. And then, in 1930, fate struck its final blow. She traveled to France with William, seeking rest after months of grief. He fell ill with typhoid, and Rosemary nursed him faithfully, her devotion as unwavering as ever. But when he stabilized, she prepared to return briefly to England to meet with architects about her memorial garden for Jeremy. She boarded a plane for the journey home, unaware that she was stepping into her final chapter. The weather turned suddenly. Storm winds battered the aircraft as it crossed the English Channel. Witnesses on the ground later recalled seeing the plane falter, shudder, and then break apart in the sky. Wreckage and bodies fell like dark stars. Among them was Lady Rosemary Leveson-Gower, just 36 years old. News of her death stunned London. Parties were cancelled, society stilled. The Prince of Wales sent roses with a simple card, his sorrow genuine and deep. At Himley Hall, Rosemary was buried in the garden she had created for Jeremy, laid to rest beside her son. Friends brought flowers, filling the air with the fragrance of remembrance. Her former fiancé, now Duke of Rutland, stripped his castle of every bloom to cover her grave. Her life had been brilliance and tragedy, compassion and sorrow. love, and loss. She had been a child of privilege, a nurse of the wounded, a mother who knew grief beyond measure, and the woman who might have been queen. Instead, she became something else, a symbol of resilience, of grace in the face of cruelty, of humanity that outshone wealth. The queen who never was, but whose story lingers quietly powerful in the pages of history. The year was 1930, and though Rosemary carried herself with the same grace that had captivated ballrooms and softened the harsh wards of wartime hospitals, those closest to her knew she was marked by grief. The garden she had begun for Jeremy, her bright 7-year-old son lost in a sudden accident, had become both her refuge and her obsession. Each stone placed, each flower planted, was a way of holding on to him. Friends said she could be found there daily, her hands in the soil, her face streaked with quiet tears, speaking softly as if her boy might still answer. She was 36 years old, young by the standards of her world, yet her spirit bore the weight of centuries. And then fate, relentless as ever, placed her on a path from which there was no return. That summer Rosemary and her husband William, Viscount Ednam, travelled to France. The plan was simple: rest, recover, and find relief after months of mourning. But almost immediately William fell ill with typhoid fever. Rosemary stayed by his bedside, nursing him as she had nursed countless soldiers in France 15 years earlier. She was tireless, tender, and resolute. She had become more nurse than aristocrat, her hands steady, her spirit unwavering. Those who watched said her devotion was absolute, that she seemed to draw strength not from herself but from the memory of those she had already lost. When William's condition improved enough that he no longer required her constant care, Rosemary made arrangements to return briefly to England. She could not leave her garden unfinished. It was her living memorial to Jeremy, her one surviving way to mother him, to create beauty where tragedy had torn everything apart. She boarded a small passenger plane bound for home, a routine flight across the Channel. The weather was fair, the skies calm. It seemed like an ordinary journey, but destiny had other plans. Several of the seats had been in dispute that day. American socialite Elsa Maxwell had originally held Rosemary's place, but changed at the last moment, giving it up to another passenger. Somerset Maugham, the celebrated writer, had nearly boarded, but was persuaded not to travel. Fate seemed to be rearranging the board, clearing space for one final cruel twist. Rosemary took her seat, unaware that history was moving swiftly toward its climax. The plane took off smoothly, cutting through the clear French air. For a time all seemed well. Passengers settled, engines hummed, and England lay waiting across the narrow stretch of sea. But as the aircraft neared the English coast, the weather shifted. A sudden gale swept across the Channel, strong winds battering the fragile frame. Villagers on the ground later recalled looking up to see the small plane shuddering in the sky, twisting unnaturally against the storm. Then came the sound, a crack, a scream of metal, the terrible roar of failure. The aircraft broke apart mid-air, scattering wreckage and bodies like dark stars falling from the heavens. Among them was Lady Rosemary Leveson-Gower. Just like that, she was gone. 36 years of brilliance, beauty, compassion, and sorrow ended in an instant above the fields of Kent. Witnesses said that as the wreckage fell, the storm passed almost immediately. A rainbow arched across the sky as villagers rushed to gather what little could be recovered. To those who saw it, it felt as though the heavens themselves were mourning her. News of the crash reached London within hours, and the city was stunned. Parties were cancelled, curtains drawn. Society, accustomed to scandal and whispers, fell silent. This was not mere gossip. This was a tragedy that struck to the very heart of its world. Rosemary was not just another aristocrat. She was the woman who had once nearly been queen, the woman whose laughter had enchanted playwrights, whose compassion had comforted soldiers, whose love had built gardens of remembrance. The Prince of Wales was shaken. He sent a wreath of roses, red and pink, with a simple card that spoke volumes in its brevity. He had loved her, respected her, admired her, and though their lives had diverged, Her death left him bereft. In letters to her mother, he confessed that it was one of the greatest tragedies he had ever known, a sorrow so heavy that he wished it had been him instead. His grief was genuine, unfiltered, and lasting. Her funeral was held at Himley Hall, the estate where she had retreated in her mourning. Friends and family gathered in the garden she had built for Jeremy. Now, instead of only her son's memory, it became her own resting place. She was laid to rest beside him, mother and child together beneath the apple tree by the brook. Flowers covered her grave, roses and rosemary and ivy, tokens of love from those who could not believe she was gone. Her former fiancé, John Manners, now Duke of Rutland, was so devastated that he stripped his own castle of every bloom to cover her resting place. Duff Cooper, her dear friend who had once quietly loved her, wrote words that cut through the sorrow like scripture. "We shall remember you, Rosemary, always. Life will be lonelier, sadder than before, but not less lovely because we shall remember." His tribute became the voice of all who mourned her, sadder, holier, forever changed. Even in death, Rosemary's work endured. The maternity hospital she had helped found continued, her name etched into its walls. The North Staffordshire Cripples Society carried on her mission. Her garden at Himley remained, tended carefully by those who loved her. And a year after her passing, the Prince of Wales himself travelled in dangerous weather to open the Rosemary Ednam Memorial Extension at Harts Hill Hospital, a wing she had envisioned before Jeremy's death. He walked the wards as she once had, speaking to patients with warmth and gentleness, as if carrying her spirit with him. "You all know the wonderful work Rosemary Ednam did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was she who inaugurated the idea of this hospital, and she who inaugurated the fund. I now open this hospital full of great thoughts and sacred remembrances." To many who heard those words, it felt as though she was present still, her legacy alive in the healing of the sick, in the compassion carried forward by those she had inspired. She was not remembered only as a beauty of her age or as the woman who might have married a king. She was remembered as a force of humanity, a soul who chose service over idleness, who turned her own tragedies into gifts for others. And yet, the shadow of what might have been lingers. What if she had been allowed to marry Edward? What if the crown had rested on her head instead of slipping into scandal decades later with Wallis Simpson? Would the monarchy have been steadier, stronger, reformed by a queen of compassion rather than shaken by abdication? It is a question history cannot answer, but it remains, hovering over her memory like the rainbow that appeared as her body fell to earth. Rosemary Leveson-Gower lived a life brief but brilliant, a waltz between privilege and pain, wealth and loss, laughter and grief. She was the girl who danced in the ballrooms of Edwardian England, the nurse who soothed shattered soldiers, the mother who built a garden for her son, the woman who captured a prince's heart, and the soul who left this world far too soon. She was in every sense the queen who never was. And though her story has been nearly forgotten, it endures in gardens, in hospitals, in memories, and in the quiet sorrow of history. In the quiet aftermath of Rosemary's death, whispers spread through Britain's drawing rooms and across its newspapers. She was gone, and with her passed not only a woman of grace and courage, but an entire possibility, a vision of what the monarchy might have been. For many, the question lingered: what if Edward had been allowed to marry her? The answer could not be written, but the speculation haunted her memory. Because Rosemary was not only beautiful, not only noble, she was someone who represented stability in an age of collapse, compassion in an age of cruelty, and dignity in a world hungry for it. Those who had known her during the war remembered her in the wards, bent over broken soldiers with her calm voice and steady hands. They spoke of her warmth, the way she could make even the most wounded man believe life still had meaning. That, they said, was the essence of Rosemary. She gave hope where none should have existed. Edward himself had seen it with his own eyes, and perhaps it was that vision of her, not her aristocratic pedigree, that had captured his heart. She was no idle beauty waiting for adoration. She was a woman of action, a woman who could have steadied a restless prince. But the crown had not allowed it. Queen Mary, bound by iron notions of propriety, had seen Rosemary as unsuitable. To her, the daughter of Millicent Sutherland was tainted by eccentricities and scandals, and the weight of the monarchy demanded purity of bloodline, and so Rosemary was dismissed. Politely but firmly, her chance to alter history erased with a single decision. For Edward, the rejection planted bitterness. He turned away from aristocratic women altogether, preferring the arms of married lovers who treated him with indifference rather than reverence. It was a path that would lead him, inexorably, to Wallis Simpson and to the abdication crisis that shook the monarchy to its core. This is the cruel irony of Rosemary's story. In her, Edward had found a woman who balanced warmth with independence, grace with wit. She was no sycophant. She teased him. She stood her ground. She advised others to treat him with a mix of deference and defiance. It was precisely that balance that drew him in. And had he been allowed to marry her, perhaps history would have been written differently. Perhaps the monarchy would not have crumbled under the weight of his scandal with Wallis. Perhaps Britain would have known a queen shaped not by controversy, but by compassion. For Rosemary herself, the crown had never been the prize. She had not sought titles or ambition. She accepted Edward's proposal reluctantly, aware of his flaws, believing she could guide him rather than be swept along by him. When the royal family intervened, she let go with dignity, never clinging, never begging. She turned instead toward her own life, her marriage, her children, her causes. But the wound lingered in silence, a door that closed too soon. Her legacy was not only the path she did not take, but the one she did. As Viscountess Ednam, she stepped into the world of politics beside her husband, bringing to campaign stages a voice both sharp and compassionate. Audiences remembered her speeches, her quick wit, her ability to pierce through pretension with a single phrase. When she spoke of women's new right to vote, her words carried weight because she herself embodied responsibility. She was not simply urging women to use their power, she was showing them how to wield it with dignity. Even more enduring was her work for the vulnerable. She poured herself into philanthropy, building institutions that survived long after her. The maternity hospital that bore her name, the children's societies she championed, the hospitals she helped equip, all were monuments not of stone but of humanity. To the disabled, to mothers, to the sick, she was not a distant aristocrat, but a woman who bent low, who listened, who offered not only money but presence. That was her real crown. And yet, tragedy had marked her life like a recurring motif. The fiancé she left heartbroken, the father she lost too young, the child she carried but never held, the son buried under an apple tree, the marriage strained by betrayals, and finally her own death in the sky above Kent. Each chapter of her story seemed etched with sorrow. But within that sorrow was strength, the kind of resilience that made her unforgettable. After her death, tributes poured in. Newspapers mourned her as one of the most remarkable women of her generation. Friends wrote of her laughter, her boundless warmth, the way she made every gathering brighter. The Prince of Wales grieved with genuine anguish, admitting to her mother that her loss was one of the greatest tragedies of his life. And those who had once dismissed her as unsuitable now wondered whether the monarchy had erred. They looked at the scandal of Edward's later years, at Wallis Simpson's arrival, at the abdication that shook the crown, and they whispered, would it have been different if he had married Rosemary? We cannot know. History does not allow rewrites, but the comparison is impossible to ignore. Where Wallis was controversial, Rosemary had been respected. Where Wallis brought scandal, Rosemary had brought compassion. Where Wallis divided a nation, Rosemary might have united it. The monarchy had chosen against her, and in doing so, it had denied itself the steadying hand of a woman who carried both grace and conviction. Yet to remember Rosemary only as the queen who never was is to diminish her. She was far more than a possibility. She was a woman who built hospitals, who stood on campaign stages, who held the hands of the dying, who mothered with devotion, who bore her grief with dignity. Her life, though brief, was full of substance. She was not defined by the crown she never wore, but by the humanity she embodied. That is why, nearly a century later, her story still resonates. At her grave in Himley Hall, the flowers still bloom. She lies beside her son Jeremy, their resting place shaded by the apple tree under which she buried him. Visitors speak of the quiet peace of the garden, of the sense that love lingers there, unbroken by death. It is a legacy no throne could ever grant, one built not of jewels or power, but of memory, compassion, and the enduring strength of a woman who lived with courage in the face of fate. And so the story of Lady Rosemary Leveson-Gower is not only a tragedy, it is a reminder of what might have been, and a testament to what was. She was the child of privilege who chose service, the society beauty who chose compassion, the almost queen who became something greater, a symbol of grace against the cruelties of destiny. The monarchy may have forgotten her, but history has not. And for those who seek the untold stories of women, her life still shines, fragile but luminous, like the rainbow that appeared in the sky as her body fell. The garden at Himley Hall became her final monument, but her absence lingered like a wound that would not heal. For her family, for her friends, and for Edward, the Prince of Wales, Rosemary's death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a turning point, a silence that echoed through the very corridors of power. In the years that followed, Edward's path became more restless, more defiant, and many wondered if the memory of Rosemary haunted his every choice. Edward had seen in Rosemary something rare, something his world was starving for. She carried not only beauty but integrity, not only laughter but compassion. She had been willing to stand beside him, not behind him, guiding him in ways no courtiers or politicians could. And when she was denied to him, when his parents forbade the match, something in him broke. His later defiance, his obsession with forbidden loves, his refusal to bend to duty, it all seemed to grow from that first rejection. Rosemary was not just the queen who never was. She was the chance for Edward to become the king he never became. Her mother, Millicent Sutherland, bore her daughter's loss with the same resilience she had shown throughout her life. The democratic Duchess had been larger than life. A woman who wrote novels, fought for workers' rights, and even organized hospitals during the war. She had raised Rosemary to believe that privilege carried responsibility, that beauty must be matched by service. And yet even Millicent could not shield her daughter from fate. When Rosemary died, Millicent withdrew from public life for a time, her activism dulled by sorrow. But even she could not let her daughter's memory fade. She ensured that Rosemary's charitable work continued, that her name lived on in hospitals and memorials, not merely in gossip columns or royal whispers. Among the aristocracy, Rosemary's death was mourned not with idle tears, but with a recognition of what had been lost. She had represented the best of their world, a woman who could charm a ballroom yet kneel by a sickbed, who could speak on a campaign stage yet still laugh with children. In her, they saw what the aristocracy could be at its best, relevant, compassionate, purposeful, and without her they saw the fragility of their glittering world. For Edward, the comparisons became unavoidable. Rosemary had been everything Wallis Simpson was not. She was respected by society, beloved by the people, admired even by those who envied her. Wallis, by contrast, would bring scandal, division, and disgrace. Edward had once told his confidant that Rosemary was the only woman he could have married, the only one who could have steadied him, and when she was taken from him, first by his parents' rejection, and finally by death itself, he turned away from the very idea of stability. He embraced chaos, as though punishing the crown that had denied him happiness. Some historians argue that had Rosemary lived, had Edward been allowed to marry her, the monarchy might never have faced the abdication crisis. Instead of stepping aside for Wallis, he might have reigned with Rosemary at his side, her compassion softening his rebellion, her dignity shielding his weaknesses. It is speculation, yes, but speculation rooted in truth. She was the one woman who had offered him both affection and guidance, love and respect, and the monarchy's refusal to accept her cost them dearly. But Rosemary's story is not only about Edward, it is about the world she shaped, however briefly. She left behind more than sorrow. She left behind institutions that carried her name and her spirit. The Rosemary Ednam House for Mothers and Infants continued its work, saving lives long after she was gone. The societies she championed flourished, carrying her compassion into decades she would never see. Her name became a quiet beacon, remembered not for scandal but for service. Those who visited her grave spoke of the peace they found there. Beneath the apple tree where Jeremy had been buried, she now rested as well, mother and son together. Friends remembered the rainbow that had arched across the sky as her plane fell, as though the world itself refused to let her story end in darkness, and in many ways it did not. Her laughter still echoed in the memories of those who loved her. Her strength still inspired those who knew her. Her legacy lived on not only in stone and soil but in hearts. In London, in drawing rooms where once she had danced, her absence was felt. At dinners and parties, her name would surface quietly, in wistful tones, always followed by silence. For those who had known her, she was irreplaceable. For those who had only read of her, she became a symbol, the woman who might have been queen, the woman whose life had been brilliance and tragedy entwined. And yet, even as her story faded from the public eye, overshadowed by the scandal of Wallis Simpson and the abdication, those who remembered her held fast. Duff Cooper, who had long admired her, carried her memory in his diaries, writing of her charm and her grace. The Prince of Wales never disparaged her as he did so many others. His respect for her endured unbroken. That alone speaks volumes. For Edward, who mocked and scorned most of his lovers in letters and confidences, Rosemary remained untarnished, forever remembered with tenderness. It is telling that when Edward looked back, his words of her were always filled with regret. He knew he had lost more than a woman. He had lost the anchor he desperately needed, and the monarchy, by refusing her, had lost the queen it might have had. Instead of stability, Britain would face upheaval. Instead of compassion, scandal. Instead of Rosemary, Wallis. In the end, Rosemary's story is both personal and political, intimate and historical. She was a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother, a nurse, a philanthropist. She was also a symbol of what might have been, a reminder that behind the grand decisions of history lie the lives of individuals, lives cut short, lives reshaped by fate. Her tragedy was not only her own, but a tragedy for those she left behind, and perhaps even for a nation. As we look back on her life, we see not only the glittering halls of her birth, or the wreckage of her death, but the threads that tie her to everything in between, the poppies she placed in soldiers' rooms, the speeches she gave to women finding their political voice, the garden she built for her son, the compassion she carried to her last breath. These are the things that outlive crowns and titles. These are the things that define her legacy. Lady Rosemary Leveson-Gower remains the queen who never was, but far more importantly, she remains the woman who was. Radiant, compassionate, tragic, unforgettable. And though history nearly forgot her, we cannot. Her story endures, a whisper from the past, reminding us that the greatest legacies are not always worn in gold, but carved in love, loss, and the courage to live with both. In the decades that followed, Rosemary's name slipped quietly into the margins of history, overshadowed by the woman who came after her. Wallis Simpson, with her scandal and allure, became the headline, the obsession, the woman who brought a king to his knees. But those who remembered Rosemary could not help but draw comparisons. They whispered that Edward had once loved a woman who would have steadied him, a woman whose compassion might have kept the monarchy whole. And the tragedy was not just that she died too young, but that her memory was eclipsed by scandal, buried beneath the weight of a story far louder and far darker than her own. For those who had known her, the comparison was painful. Rosemary had been accepted by society, admired even by her rivals. She carried herself with dignity, her charm never descending into controversy. She had represented the possibility of a queen the nation could love. Wallis, by contrast, was despised by many, accused of being manipulative, foreign, unworthy. The contrast was stark. One woman forgotten too soon, another remembered too much. Edward's heart had belonged to both at different times, but only one had the power to hold his respect even after she was gone. Among his circle, this difference was clear. Edward had often mocked or belittled the women who passed through his life, but never Rosemary. In his letters and confidences, her name was untouched by disdain. He spoke of her with regret, with tenderness, with sorrow. It was as though her absence had preserved her, forever untarnished, the lost possibility he could never recover. Even when he was entangled with Freda Dudley Ward, even when Wallis entered his life, Rosemary lingered like a shadow in the background, a reminder of what might have been. Historians later pointed out that Rosemary's rejection had set Edward on the path of rebellion. When his parents denied her, he turned away from duty altogether. He no longer sought suitable matches. Instead, he pursued women who defied the crown's expectations, women who would never be accepted. Rosemary was the last woman of his own world that he truly considered. After her, it was married lovers, courtesans, scandals. The monarchy had thought itself wise to deny her, but in truth it had unleashed the defiance that would one day bring it to crisis. Outside the palace, Rosemary's name endured in quieter ways. Hospitals bore her memory. Charities carried her legacy. Those who benefited from her compassion may not have known her face, but they felt her touch in the institutions she left behind. Mothers delivered safely in the maternity hospital that carried her name. Disabled children found dignity through the society she had led. Her life was not remembered in scandal, but in healing. And though history books placed Wallis at the center, Rosemary's legacy lived on in lives made better by her work. Yet even in these tributes, there was a sense of unfinished story. Friends who survived her spoke often of the rainbow that arched across the sky as her plane fell, as though fate itself mourned her passing. Duff Cooper's words of grief were repeated in memoirs, reminding new generations that hers had been a life of rare light. Her family tended her garden, ensuring the flowers bloomed each spring, a living memory of both her and Jeremy. And in these small acts of remembrance, her story resisted the silence that threatened to erase it. In society gossip, she was sometimes remembered in the context of Edward's loves, as the woman before Wallis, as the nearly queen, but those who truly knew her bristled at that reduction. She was more than an almost, more than a comparison. She had been remarkable in her own right. Her childhood, her service, her motherhood, her activism, these were the things that defined her. And yet history is often cruel, remembering scandals louder than virtues. Rosemary's quiet dignity could never compete with Wallis's noise. Still, her story endures for those willing to look closer. It is a story of a woman caught between privilege and pain, adored yet denied, brilliant yet broken by loss. It is the story of a woman who might have altered the monarchy, who might have changed the course of history, but whose fate was decided by others, and whose life was cut short before she could reclaim it. She was both unforgettable and forgotten, remembered by those who loved her, overlooked by the world at large. And perhaps that is why her story feels so haunting today, because in her we see not just the tragedy of one woman, but the tragedy of what happens when dignity is silenced and scandal is rewarded. We see the monarchy that chose against compassion and instead embraced chaos. We see the possibility of a queen who might have led with grace, replaced by the reality of a king who abdicated for love. And in that gap lies Rosemary, the woman who might have been, the woman whose legacy is measured not in crowns, but in compassion. Her life was short, but it left ripples. She is remembered not for what she wore, not for whom she scandalized, but for whom she served, for whom she loved, and for how she endured. And though her name may not echo as loudly as Wallis, for those who know her story, she shines brighter. She was, and remains, the untold woman. The story of Lady Rosemary Leveson-Gower does not end with her burial at Himley Hall, nor with the rainbow that appeared above the fields of Kent as her body fell. In many ways, her life continues in whispers, in gardens, in hospitals, and in the memories of those who dared to imagine what might have been. History often rewards scandal and forgets dignity, but Rosemary's life lingers precisely because it was different. It was not the story of a crown won or lost, but of humanity lived with courage in the face of relentless tragedy. For the Prince of Wales, her absence remained a wound. He had loved and lost before, but never with the same mixture of respect and regret. Rosemary was the one woman he never mocked, never diminished, never dismissed. In the private letters that survive, her memory is preserved in tenderness. He confessed to friends that she had been the only woman he could truly have married, the only one who might have steadied him, and perhaps that is the greatest tragedy. Not that she died, but that she had been denied to him long before. In the silence of his later years, when Wallis's shadow grew heavy and the abdication defined his name, the thought of Rosemary must have returned to him, unspoken but unavoidable. Among her friends, her death was mourned not only with sorrow but with reverence. Duff Cooper's tribute captured what many felt, that the world was lonelier without her, but lovelier because she had lived. To him she was not only a friend, but a presence, a force that lit every room she entered. Her laughter, her warmth, her resilience, these were the memories that endured, long after ballrooms fell quiet, and the society that once adored her crumbled into history. For her family, her loss was unspeakable. Her mother, Millicent, once a dazzling force of reform and activism, found herself dulled by grief. She carried on her daughter's work, ensuring that Rosemary's name lived on in the hospitals and charities she had nurtured. But even she could not fill the silence left behind. In the garden at Himley, Millicent often walked alone, the flowers Rosemary had planted now blooming over the graves of both mother and son. It was a sight too heavy for words, beauty masking heartbreak, roses hiding sorrow. And yet, in the communities Rosemary had served, her name became a blessing. Mothers spoke of the Rosemary Ednam Maternity Hospital with gratitude. Children healed in societies she had championed, patients recovered in wards she had helped fund. They may not have known her story, may not have recognized her face, but they carried her legacy in their very lives. She was remembered not for crowns or courts, but for compassion, and that is perhaps the truest legacy anyone can hope for. But still, the haunting question lingers: what if she had been allowed to marry Edward? Historians speculate endlessly. Could she have reigned in his impulsive nature? Could she have prevented the scandals that consumed him? Could she have become the modern Queen Britain needed in the uncertain years after the Great War? We cannot know. But what we do know is that she was denied that chance, and in that denial the monarchy itself lost something vital. Instead of Rosemary, Edward found Wallis, and with her came abdication, division, and a crisis that shook the throne. It is one of history's cruel ironies that the crown refused the woman who might have saved it and embraced the scandal that nearly destroyed it. And so Rosemary's life becomes more than a biography. It becomes a parable. It reminds us that history is not shaped only by kings and laws, but by the choices of families, the prejudices of parents, the accidents of fate. It reminds us that dignity can be forgotten even as scandal is immortalized. It reminds us that the quiet strength of one woman can outshine the noise of many. Her story also touches on something universal: the fragility of life, the way joy and sorrow dance together in relentless rhythm. She was born into castles and privilege, but she buried her own child beneath an apple tree. She was admired by princes and poets, but she died in a broken plain above an English field. She lived with laughter, but she carried unbearable grief. She was both radiant and tragic, both untouchable and achingly human. And perhaps that is why her story resonates even now. For women who know loss, for mothers who have buried children, for daughters who have carried burdens heavier than their age, Rosemary's life is not a fairy tale but a mirror. She reminds us that even in privilege there is pain, and even in sorrow there can be grace. She was not perfect, but she was real, and in her reality she was extraordinary. Today her name rarely appears in textbooks, and her face is missing from the great portraits of queens and princesses. But in the memories of those who look closer, she endures. She is remembered in gardens, in hospitals, in tributes written in diaries, in wreaths laid by a prince who never forgot her. She is remembered as the woman who almost changed history, and as the woman who, without a crown, lived with a dignity greater than many who wore one. As we close her story, we are left with an image. Not the wreckage of the plane, not the silence of her grave, but the rainbow that appeared as she fell. It was as though the world itself refused to let her story end in darkness, as though nature conspired to honor her with a symbol of light after storm. That rainbow, fleeting and fragile, is Rosemary's story. Brief, brilliant, tragic, unforgettable. And so Lady Rosemary Leveson-Gower remains the untold queen, the woman before Wallis, the mother who mourned, the nurse who healed, the friend who inspired, the daughter who carried her family's legacy, and the woman who left too soon. She is gone, but her story still asks us to remember. To remember that the greatest lives are not always measured in crowns, but in compassion. To remember that history's loudest scandals often hide its quietest truths. To remember that even in tragedy, there is beauty, and even in loss, there is light. This is the legacy of Lady Rosemary. And now, nearly a century later, her story is no longer forgotten. It is told, it is remembered, and it is cherished. A reminder that grace, even when denied its crown, still reigns. Time has a way of erasing names, yet some linger half-remembered, like a melody that refuses to fade. Lady Rosemary Leveson-Gower belongs to that haunting category. To most, her name is unfamiliar, overshadowed by the louder legends of the 20th century. Wallis Simpson, the abdication, the scandals that still fill pages. But beneath that noise lies Rosemary's story, quieter, nobler, and infinitely more human. She was not remembered because she courted attention. She is remembered because she carried dignity into every room, because her compassion softened even the harshest corners of her world. Her life traced the arc of an entire generation, born into privilege, thrust into war, transformed by love and loss, and cut short by fate. Those who had danced with her at glittering balls would later see her scrubbing hospital floors in Dunkirk. Those who had watched her sparkle as society's girl of the season would later watch her bury her child with her own hands. And those who had seen her capture a prince's heart would later stand in silence at her grave, wondering what Britain had lost when the monarchy refused her. Edward, the Prince of Wales, never fully escaped her memory. To him, Rosemary was not a passing romance, but a vision of something he would never find again. She was strong enough to laugh at him, wise enough to guide him, warm enough to heal him, and when his parents denied her, he turned instead toward rebellion, clinging to women who could never be accepted. The monarchy thought itself safe in preserving tradition, but in doing so it planted the seed of abdication. Rosemary was the choice that might have secured the crown. By refusing her, they set Edward on the path that would one day lead him away from it. But Rosemary's worth was never defined by a crown. She was a mother who loved her children fiercely, a philanthropist who built institutions still standing, a woman who believed privilege demanded service. She carried the weight of personal tragedies with grace that astonished even her closest friends. She buried her laughter beside her son's grave, and yet still found the strength to build a garden of remembrance. She suffered betrayal in her marriage, and yet held her dignity unbroken. Her courage was not in victories won, but in battles endured. And in that courage lies her true legacy. Hospitals still carried her name years after her death. Children healed in wards she had once supported. Women gave birth safely in maternity wings she had dreamed into existence. These were her monuments, not gilded palaces or jeweled crowns. They were humble, practical, life-saving, and they outlived her. The tragedy of Rosemary's life lies not only in its brevity, but in its erasure. She was almost a queen, yet she became a footnote in the story of the man who loved her. She was almost remembered, yet she was overshadowed by a scandal louder than her virtues. And yet, for those who look closer, her story is richer than any scandal. It is the story of a woman who carried beauty and grief in equal measure, who gave her light to others even as her own life grew darker, who became unforgettable not by noise but by grace. Her grave at Himley remains quiet, shaded by the apple tree under which Jeremy had been buried. Visitors say there is peace there, a sense of love unbroken by time. It is fitting, because Rosemary's story is not one of crowns and kingdoms, but of love and loss, of humanity in its rawest form. She was the queen who never was, yes, but more importantly, she was the woman who was real, radiant, tragic, and unforgettable. History may have nearly forgotten her, but her story survives in whispers waiting to be heard again, and when it is told, it reminds us that the most extraordinary lives are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones lived quietly, bravely, and with compassion. That was Rosemary's life, a brief light, extinguished too soon, but still shining in the shadows of history. In the final measure of Rosemary's life, what remains is not the crown she never wore, but the light she left behind. Her story is not one of triumph in the traditional sense, for she did not become queen, did not live to old age, did not escape tragedy. But it is precisely these absences that give her story its power, because Rosemary's legacy lies in the contrast, privilege and pain, beauty and loss, laughter and sorrow. She lived them all, and in doing so she became unforgettable to those who knew her. Edward, the Prince of Wales, carried her memory until the end of his days. She was the one woman he spoke of with respect, the one whose absence he could not overcome. Even as Wallis dominated his later life, Rosemary lingered, a reminder of a chance denied. It is impossible not to wonder if the monarchy might have been steadier, kinder, more humane had Rosemary been at his side. Instead, her rejection planted the seeds of defiance that would culminate in abdication. That is the cruel irony. The woman denied for fear of scandal might have been the very one to save the crown from it. Her friends never forgot her. Duff Cooper wrote of her laughter, of the way she made the world brighter. The Duke of Rutland, once her fiancé, wept as he covered her grave with roses. The Prince of Wales, who had danced with her more than with any other, sent his wreath of red and pink. They all knew what had been lost. And yet, even in their sorrow, they carried her memory as something sacred, untouchable by time. Her family ensured her name endured in deeds. Hospitals and charities bore her mark, her work for mothers and children continuing long after she was gone. The Rosemary Ednam maternity house stood as proof that even in death she was still saving lives. The garden she built for her son Jeremy became her own resting place, a symbol of love that transcended grief. And for those who walked its paths, the flowers whispered of a life brief but brilliant. But the world moved on, as it always does. Scandals filled the headlines. Wallis's name replaced Rosemary's in the public imagination, and history wrote its chapters in louder ink. Yet Rosemary's story still endures for those willing to look past the noise. She was not the scandalous woman who brought a king down. She was the graceful woman who might have lifted one up. She was not remembered for controversy but for compassion, not for crowns but for courage. And that is why her story matters still. In the end, Rosemary's life is not just about what she might have been, but about what she was. She was a daughter who carried her mother's strength, a nurse who healed the broken, a mother who built a garden for her child, a woman who faced betrayal with dignity, a soul who met tragedy with grace. She was, in every sense, extraordinary, and though she died at 36, her story lingers, fragile yet luminous, like the rainbow that arched above the fields of Kent as her life ended. For us today, her story is a reminder that history's quiet women are often its strongest, a reminder that the untold lives carry lessons as powerful as the ones written in bold, a reminder that grace, compassion, and resilience are legacies far greater than titles. Rosemary may not have worn a crown, but she left behind something far more enduring, humanity remembered. And now, nearly a century later, her story has been told again, told not as a footnote to Wallis Simpson, not as the queen who never was, but as the woman she truly was, radiant, compassionate, tragic, unforgettable. If you found Rosemary's story as moving as we did, make sure to subscribe to The Untold Woman. Every few days we bring you the hidden lives of extraordinary women, stories of power, scandal, love, and resilience that history tried to forget. Click subscribe, leave us a comment with your thoughts on Rosemary's life, and share this video so more people can discover her legacy. Because women like Rosemary deserve to be remembered, not in silence but in light.